The week prior to Easter is the most significant time of the year for Christians. From Palm Sunday through Jesus' passion and resurrection, these few days of suffering and hope brought salvation to uncounted millions. The story of Christ's passion is told in all four Gospels, but they don't always explain why or how these events took place. So what really happened in Jerusalem nearly 2,000 years ago that led to Jesus' crucifixion? Hello, I'm Carolyn Morrison, and welcome to Mysteries of the Church. Join me as we look into Jesus' arrest and trial.
When we look at the events of Jesus entering Jerusalem, what we would normally say is marking the beginning of Holy Week. As we look to the Gospels, particularly Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this is the moment that he's been building up to. And now we have Jesus entering Jerusalem. And he enters, in some sense, in a very dramatic fashion. He doesn't enter on a horse and chariot. Rather, he enters on, in essence, a donkey. And so, if we look at that, it draws us also back to the Old Testament, where we were told that the Messiah would enter not as a conquering hero or a warrior, but one proclaiming peace.
I think the people's reaction indicated that they very much misunderstood the intent of Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem, because they greeted him with palm branches and cloaks on the road, which was a dignity accorded to those who won great victories in military conquests. They saw Jesus, many of them saw Jesus, as their hope for liberation from political oppression, when he came to liberate us from sin and death.
Did he stage this event if it happened in the way the Gospels describe it? It's a possibility. Did the disciples stage it? It's a possibility. However it happened, and I say something does seem to have happened, it attracted attention at a time when attention perhaps should not have been attracted. The fact is, it was Passover, the city was crowded, it was very easy to get Jerusalem to the edge of a boil, and the excitement of this man, whether everybody knew who he was or not, and I think not, was enough to start, if not a riot, at least the kind of scene that could have caused trouble in the city. I suspect something happened that alerted those in the know to a difficulty latent here, and they said, this fella could be trouble.
So Jerusalem was ripe for a reaction. And when Jesus entered into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey, as a sign of great humility and meekness, as he who came as the King of Peace, the reaction of the people was one of, this is the moment for our liberation. And it was seen as a very provocative act. And it began the drama which we will see unfold on Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and ultimately on Easter Sunday.
When Jesus enters Jerusalem, one of the first acts after his entrance is him going to the temple. Now, the temple for the Jewish people is the central focus point. This is God's home. This is where God is present for the Jewish people. And it was so sacred that even the high priest would only enter the Holy of Holies once a year. So Jesus goes to the temple, and upon his arrival, he finds money changers, he finds animals. Now, we shouldn't be surprised that there were people selling doves or other animals, because animals would have been slaughtered in the temple.
The money changers, for all their bad reputation, were an essential part of temple traffic. If you were going to contribute to the temple, you had to do so in Jewish or call it, if you like, temple coin. Same thing with the sellers of animals. You couldn't be bringing a cow all the way from wherever you were traveling. So you bought what you bought, assured that it was, to use today's term, kosher, right there in the great outer court of the temple. This stuff wasn't going on in the holy, holy places.
What Jesus objected to was the manner by which, the intention that underlied a lot of that action by those who did it. They were extorting people, they were benefiting personally, they were basically oppressing God's people in those things which the Jewish law asked them to do. So that's why he reacted so strongly and literally threw them out of the temple.
Jesus, we're told in the scriptures, encounters the money changers, and he gets, in many ways, angry. He says, "You have made my father's house a den of thieves." And he tries to drive away the money changers and those that were selling animals.
The people, if you want to call them the money changers, the animal sellers, probably indignation. Who the heck do you think you are?
Jesus' entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday and his subsequent encounter with the money changers at the temple must have made an impression on the local populace. But what kind of impression did it make on the temple authorities and the Roman government? Join us when Mysteries of the Church continues in just a moment. Soon after entering Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, Jesus had a provocative encounter with the money changers at the temple. Did he do this simply to cleanse the temple of commercial interests, or was there a deeper meaning to his actions? Whatever his reasons, the disturbance he had caused was bound to attract a dangerous amount of attention from both Jewish and Roman authorities, and those in power were always ready to demonstrate just how little tolerance they had for religious troublemakers.
So there would have been some concern perhaps on the part of the Sanhedrin that there was this individual whom the crowds seemed to be coming to. We're told, in fact, that at times members of the Sanhedrin do not approach Jesus or do not arrest him for fear of the crowd. And so there is this question, how much did the Sanhedrin want to deal with this issue, and at one point would it become a breaking point for them?
The relationship of the Sanhedrin and Jesus can be understood against the backdrop of the Sanhedrin's relationship to Roman rule. Because the Sanhedrin was very much aware that with a history of rebellions prior to Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem, the Romans would not tolerate any more religious ferment. So from their point of view as the leadership of the time, the last thing they wanted is to have a religious Jewish figure ferment an uprising in their midst.
Pontius Pilate plays a significant role in the scriptures and for the life of all Christians. He was the governor of the region that Jerusalem was in. He was, in some sense, the official Roman presence answerable to the empire, and he was charged and responsible for keeping the peace.
Because let's consider for a moment, in the Roman Empire, of the provinces and governors that existed, Judea was probably considered not a prize on the outskirts of the empire. And I think it's clear and fair to say that he was not very much interested in the religious aspects of what was going on. He was really interested in governing with the least amount of trouble.
If the city exploded and it was a tinderbox, Pilate could be recalled and disciplined by the emperor. Certainly the Sanhedrin stood to lose what little power it actually was able to exercise. Caiaphas could even have been sentenced to Roman punishment.
The Romans ruled under tyranny and fear. They made it very clear they were in charge, and they would use any means by which to keep people under control. But on the other hand, they tried to respect local custom and local religious traditions because it kept the people happy. So in the time of Jesus, the last thing Rome wanted was another uprising in Jerusalem. There had been 3 in less than 30 years. The 4th would have probably been the straw that broke the camel's back.
While the Roman and Jewish authorities were jockeying for political advantage and deciding how best to deal with this man named Jesus, who seemed to be a threat to their hold on power, Jesus and the apostles calmly went about making preparations for sharing a Passover meal together.
The Gospels relate that Jesus very deliberately asked the apostles, two in particular, to go and make preparations for the Passover. And much of it was kept somewhat secret because the Lord wanted very much to celebrate this meal with his apostles. Because unbeknownst to them, he was going to give them and us a great gift, which is the gift of the Eucharist.
It was some kind of meal that was intended to bond Jesus to his disciples before what he must have sensed was an inevitable death. Whether he thought this was the night before or not is another story, but it's pretty certain that he wanted to be with them. He wanted to celebrate some meal, Passover or otherwise, that would bond them.
The role of Judas, the presence of Judas at the Last Supper, gives us many spiritual lessons. Because at the Last Supper, Jesus has that marvelous act of service to the apostles when he reclines and washes their feet. We must not forget Judas was present for that. One last great act to allow him to understand the very heart and nature of Jesus' ministry and message.
We're told that Jesus at one point will take bread, say a blessing, break it, give it to his disciples and say, "Take this, all of you, and eat it. This is my body." Eventually he will take the cup, say a blessing, pass it to them and say, "Take this, all of you, and drink it. This is the cup of my blood."
The other interesting action was prior to the giving of the great gift of the Eucharist, the Lord signaled who his betrayer was. And if you recall, he took a morsel of bread, dipped it, and gave it to Judas. Now, that bread was earthly bread. But that was the preamble to taking bread and making it the bread of life. In that one singular moment in history, Judas was given bread and chose to not stay for the eternal bread of life.
Now, we all know so well that at some point, Judas will leave. He has made arrangements to hand Jesus over to the Sanhedrin. His motives are in question. The scriptures say that the devil entered him, and at that moment he was possessed by the devil to do what he did. Other Gospels just say that he goes and negotiates with the Sanhedrin. "What will you give me if I hand him over to you?"
Some could argue, and the record could lend one to say, that it was disillusionment with Jesus' ministry. That he saw it going in a direction that he did not think was the answer. Perhaps the answer was political uprising, overthrowing the Roman authorities, and establishing the kingdom of God in human terms. But it could also be that part of his intention or motivation was to force Jesus into a situation where he would have to act. However, I think from the historical record, one could at least surmise this. Judas was given 30 pieces of silver, which was the Roman equivalent value for the life of a slave.
When you look at the four Gospels, we get varying opinions. Some people say there was no need for Judas to go off and negotiate a sum to turn over Jesus because he came from a particular family. The Gospels in many ways are ambiguous. We do know that he is the great betrayer. There are many motives. But what I think is important for all of us to realize is he does betray. And that does continue the action, the timeline per se, of allowing the Sanhedrin to arrest Jesus.
It's a subject of speculation as to what Judas actually said to the Sanhedrin. But I would think it's reasonable to presume that the Sanhedrin already knew much, that they had their informants and the people who walked with Jesus and heard about Jesus to be able to create a dossier around which, if they brought Jesus in for charges, that those charges could be at least somewhat substantiated. And ultimately, the Sanhedrin sought to condemn Jesus for blasphemy.
While Jesus and his disciples were sharing their final meal together, Judas Iscariot was engineering Jesus' arrest with the Sanhedrin. But just how much power did the Sanhedrin really have over this troublesome prophet? Stay with us as we investigate Jesus' arrest and trial. At some point during the Last Supper, Judas had left Jesus and the others to sneak off to the Sanhedrin, where he offered to betray Jesus. The Sanhedrin paid him 30 pieces of silver for his services. The trap was set. The only thing left for Judas, the Sanhedrin, and the temple guards to do was put their plan into motion. And all they needed to spring the trap was to follow Jesus to a place that would draw as little attention as possible to his arrest.
After the Last Supper, no matter what gospel we're looking at, whether it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we're told that Jesus leaves and goes to the garden. Jesus, we're told, is in the garden in prayer. In many ways, speaking with God the Father and God the Holy Spirit in prayer, asking, Father, if this hour can pass, if this cup can pass, but not my will, but yours.
So the Garden of Gethsemane was the ideal place in the evening stroll that Jesus had after the Last Supper, when he went to pray and surrendered his will completely and fully to the Father's will. That was the ideal place to move against him because no one else was there. And I think it was chosen quite deliberately to allow the least amount of interference in that one great act of betrayal. Well, the kiss that Judas placed upon the Lord's cheek has been a topic of profound spiritual reflection over the years, over the centuries. The kiss is an act of respect, an act of love, and yet that is what he chose, the symbol he chose to signal his betrayal. And it could be that in his mixed up, twisted mind, he thought that he was giving Jesus an opportunity to finally make a decision, when in fact the decision was already made, that the kingdom was going to come in spiritual power, in the redemption of sin and the conquering of death, and had nothing to do with earthly military power or the things of this world.
Now, we have in some passages, Peter taking the sword and cutting off an ear, trying to defend our Lord. And we see Jesus immediately saying, no, not by the sword. But whether we're looking at Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, what we do see is that Jesus is in control. He realizes this is the moment, not just the moment of his arrest, but as we look to the Gospels, it's the beginning of his moment of glorification, when the Father will be glorified by the actions of the Son.
It's perfectly possible that Jesus's reputation, and his reputation was principally as a worker of wonders, though we'd like to see him primarily as a kind of religious reformer, his reputation may have alarmed the Sanhedrin for the simple reason that the more attention he drew, the more likely it was that there could be trouble in Jerusalem. I don't think there was any particular animadversion to Jesus, any more than there might have been toward anybody who seemed to be a threat to the established order.
We're told in some of the Gospels that false witnesses are brought to testify against him, and they're questioning him, are you the Messiah? Are you the Messiah? And eventually Jesus will you say that I am?
So the question that was asked was about the kingship of Jesus. And it was understood to be the kingship in terms of earthly usurpation of the right of Roman rule, to assert himself as the king or the Messiah that would overthrow Roman occupation.
St. John's Gospel, the real event seems to be the raising of Lazarus, because we're told in St. John's Gospel, after that, the Sanhedrin gathers and says, many people are beginning to believe. Clearly what we do see is that Jesus was challenging their status quo. And so you can go in a multitude of directions, but they were looking for a reason to end his life.
When the Sanhedrin examined Jesus, they had a dilemma. And the dilemma was this. They sought to charge Jesus with blasphemy. And under Jewish law, blasphemy was liable, the penalty was death. But under Roman occupation, the Jews could not execute anyone. So they needed somehow, some way, to make the transition from a religious trial to a civil proceeding. And the entryway, if you will, was to see the initial charge against Jesus as blasphemy, to somehow see it as an act of sedition or treason, which would then allow Roman authority to impose a penalty, and in that case, the penalty would be death.
We're told after Jesus has been brought to the Sanhedrin, after they have questioned him, interrogated him, at times, disrespected him by hitting him, he's then brought to Pontius Pilate, who is the governor, and they want him to be killed.
When Jesus appeared before Pontius Pilate, that was the civil proceedings against him. That was his, if one could call his Roman trial. And we know from the record of the Gospels that Pilate interrogates Jesus precisely regarding this charge about being the king of the Jews. When Pilate asked directly, "Are you the king of the Jews?" nowhere in the Gospel narratives does Jesus directly answer those questions, because clearly he was not. But Jesus spoke about bearing witness to the truth, and Pilate gives the very, very, very provocative and famous question, what is the truth? The irony is, the truth is not something, it's someone. So he did what Rome normally did, was, in the rule of fear and tyranny, he had Jesus brutally beaten and mocked and scourged and even crowned with a crown of thorns in a vain attempt to appease the crowd that was gearing itself for more.
At first says, well, I find no guilt in this one, but yet we know he will sign his death warrant where he will be condemned to death by crucifixion. And so we see Pilate as an individual that wants to avoid having problems. And if it means just having someone die, well, so be it. He's not a figure that comes across by any means of having any courage, having any determination to find really what is truth. He's not worried about if Jesus really is guilty or not guilty, what he's being accused of. Pilate, in many ways, truth is relative. And we see in Jesus, truth, no, there is a truth. And he's come to testify to that, and is coming into conflict with the situation at hand.
For all the trouble the Sanhedrin went to have Jesus arrested, Pontius Pilate seemed unwilling to cooperate in their scheme to have him executed. Stay tuned for when we discover what pressure the Sanhedrin applied that would ultimately change Pilate's mind. Following Jesus' arrest by the Sanhedrin, he was turned over to Pontius Pilate for judgment under Roman law. But for some reason, Pilate seemed reluctant to condemn a man he did not know and whose guilt under Roman law was in serious doubt. As we are about to see, the Sanhedrin had no intention of allowing Pilate to turn Jesus loose to continue endangering their hold on absolute religious power.
Given the fact that Pilate was not about to worry about the niceties of Jewish law, it probably wouldn't have taken much to convince him that this guy could, in fact, have led some sort of a rebellion and was making claims to set himself against the Roman Empire.
In the end, after having Jesus brutally beaten and flogged and scourged, I believe Pontius Pilate was hoping that that would have appeased the crowd that had gathered outside his palace.
I think it's first important to realize when it speaks of the crowd, we're not speaking of the entire Jewish population. We're in fact speaking of the Jewish leaders. We don't know if every single leader was there of the Sanhedrin, but there was a significant number of people, and they're challenging Pilate.
And in that very beautiful moment when he presents the man, Jesus, before them, perhaps part of him was hoping this would have been the ending of the drama. But because the crowd was in such a fury, in such a frenzy, perhaps because of the cohort and those that were there, asking him to scream out and to ensure that that was not enough, to crucify him, at that moment, Pilate probably understood that this crowd would not be appeased. And rather than worry about a potential uprising, he had a potential uprising right in front of him that he needed to deal with in political terms.
And the question really comes down is, what is Pilate going to do? And we see eventually Pilate, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of just trying to take the easy way out, will go along, will have him condemned, will make the decision himself. He is the one who will, in essence, sign the death warrant of Jesus. And he does so, some have suggested, because he was afraid. This was his last chance. He'd screw this up, then there was nothing else for him.
He felt pressure that failing to act, matters would get out of hand. That's a possible scenario. But that Pilate, from what we know of him, would have said, oh, if this would amuse you people, well, I'll do anything to make you happy. Jesus meant nothing at all to him. He couldn't very well sign a death sentence if it could be shown that he had violated Roman law. But probably without a great deal of concern one way or another, he gave in to what his cronies, and I think Caiaphas at the least, had come to a working relationship with Pilate. It was to the advantage of both of them that the Roman authorities had to pass the sentence and the Romans had to be the ones executing him.
Unfortunately, it comes back to him, and then he just takes the easy way out and says, well, let's just get rid of this situation, and has him crucified.
And one of the gospel accounts portrays Pontius Pilate as sentencing Jesus to death and yet washing his hands clean of the blood of what he sees as ultimately an innocent man. It was the ultimate act of political expediency.
The time period traditionally between when Jesus is arrested, brought to the Sanhedrin, brought to Pilate, and eventually to Calvary, where he's died, is a short period of time. In fact, a very rapid series of events. And really within a matter of 24 hours or so, perhaps maybe a little more, a little less, from his arrest to his crucifixion, all took place.
The arrest and trial of Jesus may have seemed like nothing more than a minor power play to the members of the Sanhedrin and Pontius Pilate. But for those who believed in Jesus and his message, they had set in motion a series of events that would quite literally have an everlasting impact on the future of mankind. I'm Carolyn Morrison. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again for the next episode of Mysteries of the Church.